It's a bit of confession time, guys. For those of you not aware, I'm sure actually most of you are aware, there's a website out there called The Lurker's Guide to Babylon 5. I don't care for it that much if I'm being just 100% honest. Its layout is kind of confusing, and it's kind of weird to go through there and try to get information out of it. But, obviously, it does contain some fairly valuable stuff, most notably actual quotes from JMS, because for those of you not aware, JMS was actually pretty active back on Usenet and whatnot during the day, and answering fan mail questions, etc., and hitting the convention scene. So a lot of those quotes are present in the Lurker's Guide. But I've kind of been avoiding it for the reasons I already mentioned. It was like, eh. However, people keep bringing it up, so I'm going to try to make a slightly larger effort to read it as I go through these, and read through the Lurker's Guide, and then if I think there's anything relevant, I will bring it up henceforth. As a consequence, I can mention that this episode was actually designed and structured to be going live before War Without End. However, I am following one of the 5 orders in which the episodes can be presented, and thus that's the order I'm doing them in. If there's any issues with that, shrug. This is how they're labeled on my DVDs. So, that being said, I only bring that up because it does actually make a little bit more sense for this to happen immediately prior to War Without End rather than immediately after it. Hang on, there it is. Interludes and examinations happening right before this makes a little bit more sense, especially since Franklin seems to be doing better than he probably should at the moment, given how much time has passed. But I digress. It is interesting to me how much of this episode is devoted to Franklin, especially since I have almost nothing to talk about with him and with his character arc. I have exactly 3 notes about him. And the episode is, the walkabout term is kind of the theme. There's several characters going on a walkabout of sorts throughout this episode. But, it's not, I have nothing to say. Okay, Franklin's doing a walkabout. I've already discussed his choice and why it's relevant, so I don't really have anything else to add. I am reminded a little bit about the Inquisitor, back from Comes the Inquisitor, starring the Inquisitor. Anyways, but I remember that episode because there was that whole Vorlon philosophy. I am, you are, the Vorlons are, that whole thing, right? I'm reminded of that because that seems like what Franklin is reaching for. He wants to be, instead of being defined as a scientist and a doctor. Which is probably my favorite part, when Garibaldi hits him with that line. And he says, yeah, exactly, I'm a scientist and a doctor. In other words, he doesn't know who he is. I also find it somewhat interesting in its own right that the issue of the stims isn't even brought up in this. Because, in my opinion, that was one of the major causes of the incident and why he ended up going ahead and going on his walkabout and trying to deal with this whole situation. And instead, it's all about him trying to find himself. Now, don't mistake me, those are 2 very connected issues. Franklin himself flat out says that the stims weren't just happening because he had to be a doctor. They weren't just happening because he was overworked. That was how the stims started, for certain. But he flat out admits in that episode that he continued using the stims because he didn't want to face the fact that he knew nothing else other than the job. I became the job. I didn't know who I was, that kind of a thing. So I'm not saying they're unrelated. It's just interesting to me that, given how important the stims were to that character arc, they are basically completely ignored in this episode. The only time it even comes close to being brought up is when she asks him for medicine, and he flat out says, no, don't ask me for that. And, in my opinion, that's less about the stims and more about being a doctor. In fact, that is my second note. I find it ironic that he finds this Caitlin girl. By the way, a lot of the episode is focused on the 2 of them, which is funny because I have so little to say about it. I'm sorry, I know I already said that, but it's just, they're there. Romance of the week. I'll talk about it in a moment. But anyways, what she wanted was not someone to be there or to be with her or whatever. She wanted a doctor when he's trying to find out himself. How's that for appropriate? But the final note I have about them is the fact that apparently the lyrics for the songs she wrote were actually written by JMS himself. He actually has done some amateur musical work in the past, probably at the same level I have, for example, except he's actually more successful at it than I am. And he, mentioned that because the lyrics were intended to be kind of thematically indicative of what's going on at the time. That being said, I couldn't help but not actually listen to it. I know that sounds horrible, and I wanted to make my two, but I couldn't stand it. I'm sorry. It was bothering me, and I was like, okay, no, I'm just gonna skip by. Which actually brings me to 2 points. I have a couple other things to mention here. It has been mentioned that if you're going to do, for lack of a better term, a musical number in a episode or a movie or whatever, it needs to have some significance or relevance, or it needs to be a musical. Disney tends to get away with that thing because most Disney films are, in fact, musicals. And therefore, you walk in knowing what you're getting. Or you don't walk in at all, or you endure it because of the rest of the stuff, right? Or maybe the music's good, but in either way, the point is that still follows the pattern. What is with my glasses today? It still follows the pattern, because in most musicals, in most good musicals, the music sequences are still advancing the story. They are relevant. In other words, if I could explain this in a different way, music in a work like this should be done to progress some aspect of one of the 5 points or more of the story. The story should not grind to a screeching halt so that the music can play. And that's kind of what it felt like in this episode. That it was like, all right, we've got Franklin and he meets this girl and hang on, and you just pictured a train hitting the emergency brakes, quick! Okay, we're emergency broke. We're good. Okay, she can play the music now. Okay, the music has been played. Let's keep going. And I use that train analogy on purpose, too. Because and every time that happens in fiction, and I've seen Star Trek do this, too. I've seen other works do this as well. Every time it happens, it feels like it then takes longer to get the momentum going back for the episode proper. Overall, if this episode does feel a little bit skippable, which is funny because 2 very important things happen in this episode, but they're practically side points to the overall plot. The other thing I wanted to mention about the music thing is that I don't... How do I put this as plainly as I can? I actually guess I can't actually make my point. And now that I'm thinking... I know that sounds weird. I can't actually make my point. I don't like it. That's the simplest way I could put it. I can put up with music in my television in order to endure it for some significant purpose, but ultimately I'm still going to be inclined to just mash fast forward a little bit in order to get to the rest of the episode. It's just my own musical tastes. Anyway, so let's talk about a couple of miscellaneous things. Garibaldi's statement to Londo at the beginning is actually quite ironic when you think about it, because he says, I have given no guarantee that they won't... Oh, you're on attack. That they have not snuck into your room and will not slit your throat in the middle of the night. And Londo says, well, you haven't given me any such guarantee. And Garibaldi says, yeah, I know. Sleep tight. Now, obviously, that's a joke that works on many levels, because obviously it's a joke on the surface level. But the funny thing is, if you sit back and think about it, the Narn haven't actually snuck into his room and slit his throat, even though they have a lot of motivation to do so, and a lot of reason to do so. And there are plenty of Narn who would be insane or crazy or reckless or angry enough to ignore the, for every Centauri, 500 Narn will be killed. They ignore that particular rule in order to just go and frickin' kill someone as important and as directly responsible as Londo. Yet they still haven't. I guess the point there, the hidden point, is in addition to the fact that that guarantee shouldn't be given, it's that it would just be a paper guarantee to begin with. Which is funny because Londo himself understands that concept and has commented on that concept before. So the very act of Londo asking for a guarantee is just kind of ridiculous in the face of it. And of course no such guarantee is given because it can't be, and it doesn't matter anyways. Speaking of the Narn and the Centauri, you remember in the first season when the Centauri were basically allies and the Narn were basically the enemies? Do you remember that? I mean... You could divide it however you want based on perspective, but narratively speaking, it was clearly being presented that the Centauri were on our side, and the Narn were on their side, and that was the difference. I find it interesting how those perspectives, not just between Londo and Jakar, but between the two peoples in general, has completely shifted, to the point where now we are not just full-on allies with the Narn. We are we are part of the same organizational body as the Narn at this point. We are still working, we are reliant on the Narn, and the Narn on us in many ways, whereas the Centauri are a direct cause of several of our problems. And that's going to get worse by the end of the series, or excuse me, season, not series. But anyways, it's just interesting to see that perspective, the shift in mentality. I mean, I know absolutely that was done on purpose. It's one of the reasons that Andreas Katsulas was actually hired to do the role of Jakar. Because the actor at the time, and arguably to this day, is known so well for playing the obstinate bureaucrat, which is almost universally in fiction being perceived as a bad guy, the enemy. That being said, one other thing while I'm talking about this. So, Garibaldi has this... I mentioned there's two really important things in this episode. One of them is Garibaldi's scene with Jakar. And Jakar standing up. Oh my god, yawns. And Jakar standing up and bringing not only the Narn ship, but the non-aligned world ships. Believe it or not, that is a critically important aspect of Jakar's character development. He's already fully become a good guy. He's on our side. Fully, firmly. He understands what's required. He is willing to not kill Delenn when he learns the truth. He is part of the Army of Light. He's part of the War Council, blah, 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 right? And the Narn are our allies at this point, pretty much firmly and formally. Even the Narn who didn't want to go out there and die did so because he felt, for practicality reasons, it wouldn't be worth the risk. Not because, screw them, they're humans, or screw them, they're the enemy. He just felt that it was a tactical mistake. Thing is, that's not his call to make. I wish I could write down the whole quote, but it went on so long I had to stop. It's literally covering a quarter of my page, what I have written down. Garibaldi has this great speech to Jakar. And I wish I could have written the whole damn thing down, but it's so huge of a quote, and I couldn't find it online. It's a speech where it's done in very typically Garibaldi fashion, because it's kind of long, and it's kind of rambling, and it's kind of meandering, and it takes a bit to get to the actual point. Wow, that sounds familiar now that I think about it. But he says it with such utter heart. He is very, I've said this before, Garibaldi is so chaotic good. He is someone who just, here's what's on my sleeve, let's go, this is what we should do, and this is how we should do it, let's go. It's so Garibaldi to just come up and say, God, this is how it works. Why doesn't it work this way? Let's make it work this way, let's go. And I love that. Here's the bit I wrote down. They didn't want to go, and they didn't want to get blown out of the sky and leave Babylon 5 defenseless, and they sure as hell didn't want to die. But they did it because Sheridan told them to do it, and because it was right. But you don't follow an order because you know for sure it's going to work out. You do it what you're told because your CO has the moral authority that says you might not come back. But the cause is just, and the cause is right. And then he actually keeps going before and after that a little bit. I kind of cut it off, so I was doing the rest of that by memory. In other words, this is a very important aspect of Jakar's mentality. Remember, Garibaldi knows this, because Garibaldi has been a soldier, not just a detective, a soldier, front lines. He's been in wars before. War? Is that singular? I don't actually remember right now. He has been in at least one war. He's served his time. He knows what it's like. And while you never... It's actually kind of a balancing act, because you don't follow orders all the time, consequently, no matter what. JMS actually comments on this in the Lurker's Guide. You're not supposed to just always follow orders, but you're also not supposed to always question orders. There's a very balancing act that you have to do with regards to orders in a military doctrine, in any functional modern military doctrine. And that is a very key balancing act that, ironically, will also be something Sheridan will be dancing around in future seasons. But I love this because Garibaldi understands this concept, and Jakar doesn't. Jakar has been I hesitate to use the word leader, because it seems like I'm using the wrong term, because what I want to say is Jakar is becoming a leader. He has been a ruler. I think that's the way I want to phrase that. He has been someone who has been able to gather together hearts and minds, to unify people, to gain their respect, and to gain their trust. He has demonstrated this. That's already a part of his arc. He has in many ways become a ruler, it really feels like the wrong word, of a people. Now he has to learn how to become a leader of a people, to be the kind of person who says, this must happen. I feel like I've talked about this recently several times over on Voyager. Nightingale, it came up, and it's come up here too. One of the most horrific realities of being a leader is sometimes you have to say, you go die for a good cause, for a good purpose, because it will work, or because you hope it will work. You have to be willing to make those kind of choices. G'Kar is a very caring individual when it comes down to it, especially a fellow Narn. So by his perspective, the fact that his captain doesn't want to go out there, okay, I'll trust his judgment. I mean, I don't want to send a Narn out to his death. But he kind of has to, and as the episode showed, that was the correct call. He should have sent the Narn out. He should have sent the non... And this brings me to my next point. Credit to G'Kar, he didn't just take that lesson to heart. He took it and ran with it. He said, you're right. I do need to be able to make the right calls from the largest perspective. And what is G'Kar already good at? But unifying people. So he goes to the other non-aligned worlds, the people who are allied and part of the Army of Light, and says, ships, now! And they came. A big old Narn heavy cruiser, and a whole bunch of, a little flotilla of the Army of Light ships. And between that and the telepaths present, we have an actual chance. And the shadow ships frickin' run. I find that interesting because one of the things that is... This is sort of spoiling, but one of the things that will become apparent in just a few episodes, really, and like by the beginning of Season 4, this will be readily apparent, which we're rapidly approaching here. Wow, we're almost to Season 4, can you believe that? It'll become readily apparent that the Shadows have a bit of a fear about being wiped out, that a lot of their strategies are centered around the idea of limiting Shadow losses. I actually talked about that before, the whole Reaper concept. You know, we are stronger than you, but we still are going to be very careful and very tactical in how we approach things to ensure that we minimize our losses. That's so it's not really spoiling because that's already been an aspect of Shadow strategy. So seeing that overwhelming force coming there, and the loss of another Shadow ship, yeah, of course they ran. They turned around and was like, nope! Bye! And of course they would. Especially since now what they have feared most has just been proven and weaponized. The only thing they could do at that point was die. And so they made the correct choice, ironically, and fled. Now that's not to say this episode isn't flawless. Well, hang on. Before I get into that, and G'Kar's awesome scene, I want to talk about a couple more things. First of all, regarding that scene, I like... this is a great example of the advantage of establishment when it comes to a fictional work. We have already seen Shadow ships. I actually mentally refer to them as Shadow Destroyers. I don't actually know if that's true. I don't think that's ever referred to by anything specific, but we know there's Shadow Destroyers, or whatever, the big ships, and we know there's the little fighter ships. And that's actually all we know of for right now. So, if I ever refer to a Shadow Destroyer, I mean the big old ship, okay? I think they technically qualify as dreadnoughts by the classification of the setting. But anyways, so we have already established that Shadow Destroyers are a damned dangerous thing. They are horrifically powerful. It took multiple Vorlon ships some time and effort to take down the destroyers in the previous episode. It took significant and unique circumstances for our heroes to kill 2 Shadow Destroyers. One Shadow Destroyer twice. One in one episode, which required detonating a gate, and one in another episode, which required tossing it into a gravity well. A gas giant gravity well from which it couldn't escape. And that really helps to emphasize these things. We would not feel the danger or the impetus of, oh god, the Shadows are coming, and there's a single destroyer out there, if we hadn't already established just how damn strong these are. And this episode goes even further to reestablish it. Though this is a victory, and we defeat 2 destroyers in this episode, look at what it takes to do so. We had to have the telepaths, plural, in order to be able to accomplish this. We had to have... The White Star had to drain itself dry, basically. Remove its ability to even function normally in order to pour enough power in order to penetrate the hull and actually damage the damn ship. And then the second one, they needed multiple firepower from multiple ships, who were all also firing pretty much full tilt, while telepaths were disabling it. So the episode continues to establish these ships are strong, but it doesn't go to the extreme of, say, the Borg cube. And I hate to call Star Trek out on that, especially since I love the Borg conceptually and in many different ways, but if I'm being honest, the Borg are too strong. They are whacked out strong. And the Shadows are strong, but they are defeatable strong. They can be defeated conventionally. Although you could argue they can't be defeated conventionally, but you get what I mean. You get what I'm making that. Because it is actually amazing when you think about it what 100 ants can do to a grasshopper, was the actual reference I was going to make there. I have my note on it right there. I love that. I love the fact that it is possible to defeat the enemy without needing some big mega Deus Ex Machina Doom thing in order to be able to pull it off. Now, I also want to comment on one other thing. I've had a theory about this for a while, and I'm just going to go ahead and toss this out here because I think it's pretty codified in this episode. Just my opinion, of course. More than once, it's been portrayed that the Shadows, there's just this scream in your mind, and oh god, and they've basically been portrayed as horrific, nightmarish creatures of eldritch proportions, Lovecraftian nightmares. As they are brought further and further down to earth, so to speak, I think that is being more and more disproven. I've had a theory for a long time, and I don't think it's ever really proven or disproven throughout the series, that the Shadows are not some big, evil, malevolent farce. I think they're just alien. Let me explain what I mean by that. Many times a telepath will interact with a shadow or someone touched by the Shadows and go, wah! And just wig out as a result of it. But I don't think that's because they're seeing some eldritch, nightmarish, horrible, evil, that nightmare, death, doom, heavy metal band. But instead, I think it's more like they're alien. I wrote down the name because I couldn't remember it, but it's the episode Legacies, way back in Season 1. There was a young telepath named Alyssa Belden. You remember her? She peered into the mind of Anarn, Natoth. She did it accidentally. It wasn't on purpose. But the thing paralyzed and crippled. She was like, oh, God, nightmarish horror, heavy metal band. You see where I'm going with this? I don't think the Shadows are actually big, evil, malevolent, nightmarish creatures. I think they are just another alien race with their own agenda. I think that the reason people wig out when they interact with them is because they have such an alien mind structure that is so unlike any other they've touched that they can't comprehend it, just like every alien when you first interact with an alien species, especially on a telepathic level. I think that's actually what happened to Lita at first. It wasn't that the Shadow ship attacked back telepathically or that there was some kind of, oh my god, the horrors I've seen. No, it was just alien to her. And once she had the resolve, the strength to be able to fight back as a result of what happened to Kosh, she was able to actually discipline herself enough to push past that alien nature, keeping in mind Lita does have experience with that. She's had that first alien experience thing already, so she knows what that's like, and then push through that in order to actually be able to accomplish the mission. Speaking of Kosh, I don't have much to say about Ulkesh. If I am not mistaken, his name is never said in the show. I could be wrong about that, but his name has been confirmed in many other works, not least being by JMS himself. So I'm going to refer to him as Ulkesh henceforth, just to make things nice and clear. He is actually voiced by the same voice actor as Kosh, which is good. I would have actually felt really bad if the poor guy actually got fired just because his character got killed. I know, just because his character got killed. That's not a reason to stop acting. But, I don't have much to say about him, actually. Only three really quick things. First of all, I'm pretty sure Lita actually felt Kosh's death. I'm also pretty sure that it's funny that the one person she didn't really ask about Kosh's death until kind of incidentally later was Sheridan, who is the one who actually was present when Kosh died, so to speak. It's also interesting that Sheridan did not mention the specifics of the dream. That leaves us a question. Is he keeping that to himself? Very possible. He doesn't really know Lita that well. Or does he not actually remember the communication with Kosh? And if so, that sucks. Like, I really want him to remember that. Kosh's final words. That was a powerful damn scene, and he should remember that conversation, damn it. The other thing I want to mention is obviously Ulkesh's design is very deliberate. We've actually seen Ulkesh, I think, once before now. And of course, in the beginning, or is it in the beginning? I can't remember the name of it. The mini movie that happens before all of B5 occurring during and around the First Contact War. Ulkesh is present and is actually one of the people who is involved with pushing the Minbari towards the inevitable realization of the human situation. But Ulkesh provides a very interesting contrast to Kosh. Kosh obviously is probably just a little bit too sentimental when it comes towards the lesser races. Ulkesh is the exact opposite and is probably far too militaristic when it comes to everything in general. And we'll be saying more of Ulkesh in the future. I'm not going to say much more else now because we have so little to go off of, but I will mention that it's interesting that the first damn thing he does is physically attack Lita. Someone who is there seeking him as an aid and is apologizing for it. That variance in tone says a lot about Ulkesh versus Kosh, and very clearly establishes to the audience the difference in the character. As a further aside, I find it interesting that as recently as a couple of years ago, I have heard people still debate Ulkesh and his motives and his mindsets. But we'll save more of that for later. I do have one last thing to mention, though. I have a theory that I don't think is ever 100% confirmed or denied, that the Vorlons use the 1-up system from Mario Brothers. Hear me out. I think that the reason... We know that Kosh was temporarily keeping a piece of himself within Lita. And that's mentioned pretty flat out in this episode, because Ulkesh was like, where the hell's the piece of Kosh? We're also pretty sure, based on things, that a piece of Kosh is in Sheridan now. That is very, 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 very likely, to the point of, I'm not even sure we can call it speculation at this point. I think that's how they... 1-up, basically. I think that's how they are able to survive otherwise catastrophic circumstances. They leave a piece of themselves in someone else, which can then exit and reform or regrow into the original being, or a new version of the original being. Possibly a form of cloning, depending on how you think of it, or possibly a form of just ensuring that their memories and their function continue on. I'm not actually sure. There's a lot of different ways you can interpret that, but that's my personal interpretation, especially given the way Ulkesh was kind of pissed about Kosh's piece not being around. And some other things I can't go into yet because, spoiler. Spoiler. Let me check my notes. I feel like I've missed a couple of things. I do like the fact that Sheridan basically took a walkabout right at the beginning of the episode. It is interesting how in science fiction you have the option to do something like that. There's probably people in real life who, if you had the hey, do you want to go walk out on the path of a station? The response would probably be like, no, God, no. And yet, when you're in a society, when you're in a culture where space travel is so normal, and you literally live on a space station, it's actually not that hard to perceive the idea of that being normal for them. Kind of the equivalent of you going on a long hike up a mountain trail, for example, or going out to the woods, just take some time to yourself, you know? That's about as close as it gets on a space station, and I like that. And it was just a nice little cultural touch, really little thing. But it also meant that, of course, Ulkesh could go and have that personal message to Sheridan. Checking my notes. Let's see... Vert. Of course, I just have a brief note, but I've kind of already covered it, about the necessity of intelligence in war. Garibaldi kind of hits this point much stronger than I have already talked about this. Intelligence is mandatory to proper warfare, and I do mean mandatory. They need to know if they have this weapon against the shadows. They need to verify their theory. And they need to do it despite the tremendous risk. I do like that the tremendous risk is emphasized. And I like that if not for G'Kar, and by consequence, if not for Garibaldi, they would have died. They would have been frickin' dead. 1 Minbari cruiser and 1 drained White Star versus 4 Shadow Destroyers? Yeah, no. At best, they might have escaped with damages and possibly the loss of the cruiser. Maybe. And even then, who's to say that their escape would have gotten them anywhere, because shadow vessels can just escape too and chase you. And yeah. So I'm pretty sure that if not for that inclusion, It's emphasized that it was a very dangerous thing to do, but it's also emphasized that it was in fact worth it. And I like that. We now have a weapon. We now formally, firmly, officially have the ability to hurt the shadows conventionally. We'll see where that goes in the future. See you next time, guys.
You